If you want to build wealth from nothing, the first thing you must understand is that most people are trying to win in the wrong arena. They think money is mainly about working harder inside somebody else's structure. They think the answer is more hours, more obedience, more credentials, more patience, more savings, more self-denial, more waiting. That is how you become dependable. That is how you become employable. That is sometimes how you become comfortable. It is not usually how you become truly wealthy. I am not saying effort does not matter. It does. I am saying effort behaves differently depending on the game you are inside. And if you spend your best years inside a game that rewards obedience more than ownership, you can become very competent and still never escape the basic condition of having to ask the next month for permission to exist. That is the real trap. Most people are taught to think about wealth as if it were a moral reward for good behavior. Study hard, get the grades, find the stable job, be realistic, avoid embarrassment, save what is left, invest conservatively, wait 40 years, and one day, if you were very disciplined and very lucky and never got hit too hard by life, the system may hand you a softer old age. That is the official script. It is respectable. It is clean. It is also incomplete enough to keep millions of smart people living inside a polished cage. The deeper truth is colder. Wealth is not mainly a reward for effort. It is a reward for position, for ownership, for leverage, for being placed near the part of the system where value is set, controlled, protected, multiplied, and transferred. If you miss that, almost every piece of financial advice sounds reasonable and still leaves you on the outside of the real game. That is why I want to talk to you about 3 steps, not 3 habits, not 3 motivational slogans, 3 structural moves. The first is to move from being priced by the market to building something that participates in pricing. The second is to move from naked competition toward durable advantage. The third is to turn temporary gains into structures the future cannot easily take back. That is the arc. And if you follow that arc for long enough, you stop being a man who sells effort into a system and start becoming a man who owns pieces of the system that other people must pay to use. That is what the wealthy understand, whether they explain it honestly or not. Most people spend their whole lives in the first layer of the economy. They earn money, they budget money, they worry about money, they save money, they ask permission from money. The wealthy at the higher levels spend their time doing something else. They decide where money flows. They create products that set terms. They own the rails other people must travel on. They build toll booths. They create scarcity. They place themselves where each new dollar passing through the system owes them a small tax. That is a very different way to live. Now, the source document you gave me describes this reality in a more extreme and conspiratorial style, talking about elites, secret games, and systems designed to mislead ordinary people. Fayfalicite, Fayturn 39, File 0, Fay. I think the valuable core is simpler and more useful than that. The valuable core is this. The rich do not usually win because they are morally better or because they merely work harder. They often win because they understand layers of the game that ordinary people are never clearly taught. That is the thing worth stealing, not the melodrama, the structure. And once you see the structure, your strategy changes. You stop worshiping fairness. You stop expecting salary to become freedom on its own. You stop assuming competition is the place where the biggest fortunes are made. You stop treating savings as the destination, and you begin asking better questions. Where in this system are prices really set? Where in this system does scarcity get protected? Where in this system do legal forms turn fragile income into durable wealth? Those are wealth questions most people never ask them enough. That is why they remain workers even when they are intelligent enough to become more. Now let us begin with the first step. Move from being priced by the market to participating in pricing. This is the deepest divide between ordinary income and wealth. When you work for wages, the market is pricing you. A company decides what your hours are worth. A manager decides what your raise is worth. An employer decides how replaceable you are. A labor market decides whether your skill is abundant or scarce. You can become highly paid in that world. Yes, you can become respected in that world. Yes, but you are still living inside an arrangement where your life is traded in units and your bargaining power is always relative to somebody else's alternatives. That is not ownership. That is rented usefulness. A man can rent out his usefulness for decades and still never own enough claims on the future to change the terms of his own life. That is why so many hardworking people feel something strange in middle age. They did what they were told, they improved, they endured, they became valuable, and yet the feeling persists that the machine is still stronger than they are. That feeling is often correct. Because unless your labor is being converted into ownership, you are still carrying the machine much more than the machine is carrying you. This is why the first real step toward wealth is not simply earn more. It is earn in a way that builds claims. A claim on future cash flow, a claim on a productive asset, a claim on a growing enterprise, a claim on intellectual property, a claim on a distribution network, a claim on some category of value that can keep paying you even when your body is resting. That is the dividing line. Workers sell hours. Owners accumulate claims. The public keeps being told that the secret is productivity. Productivity matters, but only if it changes your position. A doctor who earns an enormous income but spends like a king and owns almost nothing except a busy schedule can still live a more fragile financial life than a boring small business owner whose company throws off predictable cash flow month after month. A brilliant employee can be richer in income and poorer in structure than an ordinary operator with 3 ugly assets that produce money while he sleeps. That is the cold truth. Income is not the same as control. Most people are dazzled by income because income is visible. True wealth often begins with invisible claims. A small equity stake, a side business built carefully over years, a product that keeps selling, a tiny service company with recurring customers, a share of a venture, a niche software tool, a property bought sanely that throws off steady rent, a licensing arrangement, a distribution relationship, a boring little toll booth. The first wealth step is not romance. It is transition. You use labor to escape pure labor. That is the adult version. I am not telling you to quit your job tomorrow and start reciting slogans about entrepreneurship. That is how unserious people ruin their lives. If you are starting from nothing, the bridge matters. You use the job to build margin. You use the margin to build the first small claim. You use the first claim to reduce dependence on the job. Then you repeat. That is how the game actually changes. A person trying to leap directly from zero to free often breaks himself. A person who slowly converts labor into ownership is playing a more intelligent game. And that game compounds. Now, there is another layer inside this first step that most people miss. The richest people are not only owners, they are often close to the sources of allocation. What does that mean? It means they occupy positions where they are not merely selling something into an existing market. They are shaping what gets funded, what gets distributed, what gets prioritized, what gets seen, what gets financed, and what terms everyone else accepts. That is a much higher layer of the game. If you control distribution, you influence what wins. If you control financing, you influence what can grow. If you control a standard, a platform, a marketplace, or a system of rules, then you are no longer one more merchant in the bazaar. You are becoming part of the bazaar itself. That is where serious wealth really begins to accelerate. The public often thinks wealth comes from heroic competition. In reality, large wealth often comes from escaping pure competition, which takes us to the second step. Move from competition toward durable advantage. The source file talks about monopoly control privilege and the reality that great fortunes often come from reducing competition rather than submitting to it. Fay Philocite, Fay turn 39, file 0, Fay strip away, the most sensational phrasing, and what remains is one of the most important truths in business. Competition is wonderful for the customer and often terrible for the owner. If 10 people can easily do what you do, your margins get competed away. If anyone can copy your offer quickly, your returns get competed away. If the market is perfectly open, transparent, and frictionless, then most of the economics eventually go to the buyer, not the seller. That is why every serious business builder spends his life trying to answer one question. How do I become harder to replace? That is the legal, clean, and productive version of rigging the game, you build a moat. You own a brand that lowers customer uncertainty. You build a network effect. You capture a niche that is too small for giants and too difficult for amateurs. You develop a system with real switching costs. You control a scarce input. You secure contracts that lock in demand. You build intellectual property. You accumulate trust in a category where trust is expensive to recreate. You create convenience so strong that customers stop reevaluating the market every week. That is what durable advantage looks like in the real world. It is not always dramatic. Often it is boring. That is one reason people miss it. The public likes heroic stories about genius inventors and charismatic founders, but durable advantage is often built by quieter people doing uglier things, simplifying a painful process, owning the local service route, building the software layer nobody wants to switch away from, controlling the cheapest channel, owning the permitting knowledge, being the only credible supplier in a niche, locking in distribution, reducing the customer. Need to think. These are not glamorous victories. They are structural victories. And structure is what creates wealth. This is why I dislike lazy business advice that tells people to follow their passion. Passion does not create margins by itself. Advantage does. If your passion sends you into a crowded field with no pricing power, no moat, no lock, in a no differentiating structure, you have not found freedom. You have found elegant competition. Elegant competition still kills owners slowly. The second step of building wealth from nothing is not merely starting something. It is starting something that has a chance to become hard to attack. That is a different level of thought. Now let me be careful. I am not saying you need a government charter, a regulator in your pocket, or some secret backroom privilege to build wealth. The source material leans very heavily into that world. Fay Phyllosite, Fayturn 39, File 0 Fay. I think the more useful lesson for an ordinary person is this. You may not control the state, but you can still think like someone who respects barriers. A person stuck in pure competition is running uphill forever. A person building toward advantage is building downhill eventually. That may mean a tiny local moat at first, a customer list nobody else has, a process no one else mastered, a reputation in a particular community, a software script that makes your service cheaper to deliver than the next man, as a channel on a platform that became trusted in a very specific category, a newsletter with the right audience, a licensing relationship, a specialized trade skill in a region that underproduces it. There are many ways to become difficult to replace without becoming a cartoon monopolist. The point is not scale alone. The point is insulation. If you want to get rich from nothing, you must become allergic to the idea of building your whole future in the most crowded lane possible. That is what the average person does. He follows the obvious path, enters the same field as millions of others, competes on the same terms, and then wonders why the rewards look mediocre unless he works himself into a nervous system problem. That is not a mystery. It is competition. Competition is what average life feels like when you do not own a moat. This is why I would rather own one mediocre toll booth than 10 heroic jobs. A toll booth improves with every extra traveler. A job simply demands the next day of my life. That is the difference. Now let us take the second step deeper. Durable advantage is not only business side, it is also personal. A person can build a personal moat, a rare combination of skills, a reputation for reliability in a room where reliability is rare, the ability to speak across two worlds that usually do not understand one another. Technical skill plus sales, creative taste plus operational rigor, financial literacy plus emotional steadiness, coding plus domain knowledge, management plus trust, taste plus distribution. These combinations matter because the market rarely pays dramatically for one common skill in isolation. It pays up for combinations that remove friction and reduce uncertainty. That is how personal pricing power grows. So even before you own a real asset, you can start building the preconditions for stronger ownership by becoming more difficult to replace. Again, the point is not to work harder inside pure competition. The point is to become less exposed to pure competition. That is the second step. Now we come to the third. Turn temporary gains into durable structures. This is where many intelligent strivers fail after doing the first two steps partially right. They earn more. They start owning something. They get some luck. They build a little advantage. Then they lose the gains because they never convert the progress into protected structure. This is why I say wealth is not only about making money, it is about locking in favorable asymmetries before life, taxes, inflation, bad decisions, or future chaos can dissolve them. The source file talks about legal privilege, embedded protection, and the way major fortunes become dynastic when advantage gets written into structures that last. Fay-Falasite Fay-Turn 39, File 0 Fay again. Strip away the dramatic language, and what remains is a deeply useful principle. If you create value and do not protect it, you are still fragile. If you build something productive and leave it exposed to bad ownership design, bad tax structure, bad contracts, bad financing, or bad succession, then you have not finished the job. That is the third step. Turn success into architecture. This is where ordinary people often get bored because architecture feels less exciting than creation. Good, boring things are where wealth often becomes durable. The rich do not only make money, they house money. They title it correctly. They isolate liabilities. They choose jurisdictions. They use entities. They negotiate contracts. They capture equity rather than only salary. They understand taxes well enough not to hand over future compounding carelessly. They separate productive assets from personal chaos. They think about who can touch what, who can sue what, who can inherit what, who controls what, and how long the structure survives without constant heroics. That is what durability looks like. If you earn one good year and spend it, that is not wealth. If you build one asset and keep it in a fragile shell that breaks in a lawsuit, a divorce, a tax misstep, or a credit shock, that is not durable wealth either. If you create a business but never systematize it so it can operate without your daily exhaustion, then you built a better job, not a wealth machine. The third step says, take the gain and turn it into a structure. Perhaps the first gain buys liquidity and runway. Perhaps the next gain buys your first productive asset. Perhaps the asset is then housed in an entity that protects it. Perhaps your intellectual property is documented properly. Perhaps your business shifts from you doing everything to systems doing more. Perhaps you use tax shelters legally available instead of performing financial innocence. Perhaps you build succession, redundancy, and optionality. That is the game mature capital plays. This is why so much self-made success evaporates. People think the hard part was making the first pile. Sometimes the harder part is keeping the pile from dissolving once it finally arrives. That is why the third step matters so much. Convert movement into permanence, or as close to permanence as life allows. Now, a lot of people hear all this and say something like, so are you telling me the system is unfair? Yes. But that is not the useful stopping point. If you stop there, you become bitter and stationary. The better response is, since the system is not fair, which forms of unfairness can I learn from without becoming corrupt? That is the more adult question. The rich are not only beneficiaries of unfairness, they are often students of structure. They understand that there are layers above effort: ownership advantage, legal form, network, jurisdiction, timing, access. You may not control all of them. Fine. You do not need to control all of them to move your life. You need to move from zero control to more control. That is enough. You need to stop acting as if fairness alone can be your strategy. It cannot. Now let me say something about money itself, because the source file talks in sweeping historical terms about controlling money creation, banking power, and who gets capital. Fay-Falasite Fay-Turn 39 File 0 Fay. The most useful translation of that for an ordinary builder is not that you should fantasize about running a central bank. It is that you should become very attentive to who gets funding, on what terms, and why. In every era, the people closest to cheap capital gain advantages that ordinary savers do not. That is reality. Cheap credit for a productive acquisition is one thing. Expensive credit for groceries is another. Equity capital that lets a firm scale is one thing. A worker trying to save slowly while his money is diluted and his wages taxed is another. Once you see that, You stop moralizing money and start analyzing access: who gets capital, who gets it cheap, who gets time, who gets patience, who gets rescued when wrong, who gets punished immediately when wrong. That is wealth literacy, and it should change how you behave. You should seek environments where capital flows. You should learn how financing decisions are made. You should become useful to the people who allocate resources, not only to the people who supervise tasks. You should think less like a consumer of financial products and more like a future allocator. Even if your scale is tiny at the beginning, that mindset matters. Because one of the biggest differences between the poor and the wealthy is that the poor think mainly in prices while the wealthy think mainly in structures. The poor ask, "Can I afford this payment?" The wealthy ask, "What does this asset do to the balance sheet?" The poor ask, "Is this expensive?" The wealthy ask, "Who controls the terms?" The poor ask, "Is this safe?" The wealthy ask, "What is the downside if I am wrong, and who absorbs it?" These are very different mental habits. That is why ordinary financial advice so often fails ambitious people. It teaches them to become cleaner consumers of money. It does not teach them to become owners of claims, builders of moats, or protectors of structure. That is why I say the three-step game is different. It begins with labor but does not stop there. It begins with discipline but does not worship discipline for its own sake. It begins with realism, not fantasy. Now let me bring this down to the person who is starting from nothing. No network, no family capital, no elite cushion, no special last name. What do the 3 steps look like for him? First, he stops treating his job as the destination. The job becomes staging. He gets more serious about skill because skill improves income and bargaining power. But he does not lie to himself that labor alone will save him. He starts buying claims, even tiny ones, a side service with recurring clients, a product, a content asset, a small cash flowing thing, a narrow niche operation, anything that begins the transition from rented effort to owned output. Second, he stops worshiping pure competition. He asks where he can become harder to replace, where he can build a moat, where he can combine skills, where he can operate in a less crowded lane. He studies boring businesses. He studies switching costs. He studies why some ordinary-looking firms quietly mint owners while glamorous sectors chew people up. He gets colder about advantage. Third, when gains come, he does not merely celebrate them. He houses them, protects them, extends them. He keeps living below the level that would make him strategically fragile. He values liquidity. He learns tax structure. He thinks about entities, contracts, reserves, and succession earlier than the crowd does. He acts like a steward before he feels like a tycoon. That is how you build from nothing in the real world. Not with one giant move, with repeated structural decisions. Now let me say something uncomfortable but liberating. Not everyone can become a billionaire. That should not bother a serious person. The goal is not to imitate the top 0.01% in costume. The goal is to stop living entirely inside a game built for dependency. If you can move from pure labor to some ownership, from pure exposure to some moat, from temporary gains to durable structure, then you have already left the most dangerous part of the trap that matters enormously, because freedom grows in layers. The first layer is margin. The second is ownership. The third is protected ownership. The fourth is compounding protected ownership. The fifth is choice. Most people want to start at choice. That is why they remain frustrated. Choice is expensive. It is purchased through the earlier layers now. I want to say one final thing about the emotional side of this, because the emotional game destroys more futures than the mathematical game ever does. The world will try to make your move toward ownership feel strange. The world will try to make your careful use of leverage feel risky and your mindless consumption feel normal. The world will try to make your desire for structure feel cold and your willingness to drift feel healthy. Why? Because drift is socially easy. Ownership is socially disruptive. A person who starts building claims behaves differently. He asks different questions. He says no more often. He becomes less available for scripts that require his obedience. That change makes people uneasy. Good. You are not trying to become more agreeable to a system that wants your labor. You are trying to become less dependent on it. That is the whole point. So here is the final choice. You can keep playing the old game, sell time, save slowly, compete in crowded rooms, trust fairness too much. Spend first and structure later. Hope discipline alone will someday turn into freedom. That is what most people will continue doing. Or you can do the harder thing. You can start the transition from labor to ownership. You can build toward advantage instead of volunteering for pure competition forever. You can treat gains as raw material for durable structure rather than as an excuse to upgrade your costume. You can stop asking what sounds respectable and start asking what changes your position. That is the three-step wealth game. Not glamorous, not easy, very real. And if you stay with it long enough, you stop being one more hardworking person hoping the system eventually notices. You become a person building claims the system itself has to respect. That is when money stops being a monthly argument and starts becoming leverage over your own life. That is when the game changes. And most people never get there because nobody ever told them there were different games in the first place.